Hi there, welcome back to the Marrow Thieves. Today's chapter is called Rogarou Comes Hunting. And then after that, we'll be reading On the Road, which is on page 154. So starting on Rogarou Comes Hunting on page 156. We were on day 8 since Riri, keeping a steady pace with early mornings and late nights, when we were jerked to a stop by Mig. He stood stock still for a minute, head tilted towards his right shoulder so that his good ear was raised to the tree line. Off the trail, now! Now! He chopped the air with his arm, directing us to scatter left into the trees. We jumped, clearing the taller grasses and crashing into the low-hanging branches with our loaded backs and stacked shoulders. Tree and Zequan each had an arm under Minerva's, so that she almost floated into the bush, still hanging her head as she had been for the past week. Mig stayed on the trail until we were all off and then slipped in beside us, quickly passing us in near complete silence. Then I heard them. Sharp, short blasts of fetid breath pushed through a metal cylinder through the scruff of a combed down mustache. There were two of them, about half a mile away. Fucking recruiters, Zequan said in a loud whisper. We gained speed and agility at the threat on our heels, jumping a narrow gorge and crossing a clover-filled clearing like gazelles with pack saws. Mig turned to the right and we followed, tumbling through a dense thicket, coming out on the other side into another low clearing with nettles in our hair. We ran until we couldn't hear the whistles anymore, until we'd zigged and zagged our way to what seemed like an untraceable spot. It was nearing dusk when we finally stopped. Minerva was half asleep in the twins' grip, and Chiboy had sweat through his outer sweater by then. There! Meg pointed with his chin to a dark smudge, only visible through the trees by the geometric slope against the slash of branch and leaf. It's an old barn. Chiboy, come with me to check it out first. We can crash there. There'll be no fire tonight, so walls would be good. Frenchie? Meg said. Take lookout position there. He pointed at an oak about 15 feet from where the group was huddled. I shrugged off my pack and took a run at the trunk. By the time I stopped, I was high enough to see over the scatter pines and over the roof of the barn where Mig and Chiboy were scouting. The sky was navy blue in the east, azure overhead, purple bleeding out to a pink-stained orange in the west. The north was black. There was the direction we were headed. The medicine wheel wearers were down south. The schools were an ever-spreading network from the south, stretching northward, on our heels like bushfire. Always north. To what end? Now we'd lost Riri. Now I'd shot a man. Would I ever be welcome in the north? I couldn't even protect a little girl. Tears flooded my eyes. I wiped at them furiously with my sleeve. I had to keep a sharp eye. Couldn't lose another one of us. Mig's fluttery owl call brought me back down to earth. Rose was waiting for me with my roll. Let's get going. We can't make light tonight, so we need to hurry if we want to get camp settled in the barn. I took my baggage and unloaded Riri's off the top of hers to add to my own. We couldn't ditch her stuff. Not yet, anyway. She rewarded me with a smile that showed a missing tooth on the left side and a dimple on the right cheek. I would have carried 1,000 pounds for that. The barn was empty. Not even the leftover scent of manure greeted us. At first it seemed all hollow and singular, but by the last fading light of the moonless sky, we caught the outline of a ladder on the far wall. Tree held the base while Zequan carefully made his way up, testing each rung with his rubber boot before putting weight on it. Then he disappeared into the darkness. There's all soft hay up here. Can we sleep here? Zequan tossed down a few handfuls like confetti. It was a loft. We each went up the ladder one by one, plopping into the soft nest of hay. Fine, we can stay up here tonight. Mig tried to be stern, but he was already fluffing up a nice soft bundle to lie back on. But being cut off from the exit's not a good idea, so it's early to rise tomorrow, before the sun even, so we can put some more ground between us and them. Hey, Mig! It was Wab calling up from below. Minerva won't come up! We leaned over the edge to check it out. Sure enough, Minerva stood far back from the ladder, arms across her chest, kerchief tight around her fat face. Minerva? She just shook her head, not even looking up at Mig. Minerva, you okay? She nodded, her mouth a thin line. You want us to come down? We all held our breath. Slopper immediately pretended to be asleep, letting out one fake, wavering snore. No! She almost shouted it. Stay! We sighed. Slopper's eyes opened. Okay, okay. Mig rubbed his chin. Did you want us to make your bed down there? She nodded again, and walked to the center of the open barn, pointing at the floor, directly in the middle. It's not going to be very comfortable, Min, Wab cooed. Her concern was greeted with a grunt and arms refolded over 3 layers of sweater. Minerva had been irrational since Riri's fall. It had been 8 days of forced meals, stubbornness, and waves of tears. Even getting her into the bush to relieve herself was an operation in patience. All right then, Mig conceded, swinging his feet over the edge of the ladder. Let's get you settled. Mig and Wab made Minerva a nice bed that night, using 2 donated sleeping bags from the contented kids in the loft. Mig even had his nighttime smoke down there with her, taking extra long hauls so she could smudge herself, making shallow cups out of her crepe paper fingers, and pulling the smoke over her covered head. I watched for a bit, and at one point she looked up, right at me, and held a single finger to her lips. I was already quiet, so I didn't quite get it then. But then again, what was there to get about Minerva? I kept an eye on the 2 elders before, but when Rose accidentally kicked my foot and then left her warm toes against my sole, I lost all sense of anything other than that one patch of skin. Eventually, Wab and Mig came up and settled in, and I dozed off to the sounds of genuine sleep from my patchwork family. I was dying. We were dying. That's the only reason for a noise like this. Scree! Sharp metal, angular auditory jabs, cold, dry, biting alarm. I sat up. 7 other heads popped up around me. From close by there was a chaos of singular lights, flashlights bouncing off the trees, shuffling polyester shorts, and squeak of gym sneakers on a wooden floor. And those whistles! Scree! I held my head over the edge, and for a moment, in the bounce of a flashlight, I saw Minerva's face, wide awake and without fear. Again, she caught my eye and held her finger to her thin lips, just for a split second, before they curled back in a mischievous smile. Then her face was gone, swallowed by the dark. More lights, rushing figures, 3 of them now in the shuffle and slide of runners. Mig yanked me face down in the hay. I heard muffled voices as the others were tackled and muzzled in the loft. This is for the good of the nation. You'll see, Granny, one recruiter said. You are doing a great service, ma'am, said another. The world needs you, and of course you want to do your part for such a great world, said a third. Then they turned their beams to the walls, the ceilings, along the floors, and into the corners. Clear, said one recruiter. Clear, said another. Clear, said a third. Then they dragged out Minerva, who stayed silent, whose smile was the last thing we saw as they turned through the doorway, whom we were sure we would never see again. We listened to the branches break, the dirt get unsettled, the grasses sway, and from somewhere close by an engine started up and roared off, headed south. I felt for Rose and pulled her close to me as she sobbed, my own tears caught up in the thick web of her braid. When we finally convinced ourselves to move, to make the day real, the sky was a cerulean blue with a light gauze of striated clouds. Mig swung his foot over. Jesus! He yanked it back. We watched him with our swollen red eyes, anxious and numb at the same time. Damn ladder's gone. He hung his head over. Cheeboy joined him. I don't see it on the ground. Couldn't have fallen or it'd be right there. They turned and locked eyes, understanding the weight of what had happened, taking in that Minerva had moved the ladder sometime in the night before the recruiters woke us, understanding that she'd sacrificed herself and allowed us to remain hidden. How long had she known that they were coming? How were we going to get down? Wab's voice was husky with unshed tears. She rocked herself back and forth on her heels, Since she no longer had Riri to comfort in these situations, Wab had to face herself, and it made her more fragile. Slopper threw himself back on a pile of hay, contentedly stretching his back into the softness. Man, we're stuck. I had an idea. I grabbed a handful of hay from beside me and threw it over the edge. Then I grabbed another and another, throwing it off as fast as I could. Rose caught on and started kicking it over. Hey, Slopper complained. Quit tossing all our bedding. Mig clued in and mimicked Rose's kicking, and the others joined in. Slopper sat in the corner hoarding his own pile of hay until Tree explained to him that we could jump off the loft if we had something below to break our fall. We threw our packs into the ground below, and then one by one we jumped after them. When the last body had fallen, we straightened ourselves out and re-shouldered our packs. We stopped at Minerva's bed, rolled up the bags, and folded her faded star blanket. Wab took that one. She unfolded it halfway to tuck Riri's soft blankie inside, and then folded it back over, her grief inside grief like the blankets themselves. It was Rose who found the jingles. In a small fold of hide were 24 rolled tin lids. They weren't smooth and uniform like the jingles we'd seen in old pictures, hung from women's dresses, being danced into grand entries at the old powwows when we were safe to make noise. These were rough around the edges from our camp can opener, and stamped with expiry dates and some with company names, Campbell's, Heinz. We passed them around, careful not to slice our fingers on their jagged curves. But why? Aren't these supposed to make noise? Slopper was confused. We'd been told over and over that silence was the only way to move out here, the only way to stay alive. It was Cheeboy who answered, out of character. Sometimes you risk everything for a life worth living, even if you're not the one that'll be alive to live it. We wrapped them back up in the hide we'd found them in, and Rose pushed them into her pack, tears streaming down her dusty cheeks. Mig left a pinch of his precious tobacco on the spot, and mumbled his own goodbye as we shuffled out into the bright new day. Well, he said, joining us in our squinty examination of the woods, north it is. He turned to start the jog back into the cover of bush. My feet wouldn't move. No! I barely recognized my own voice. The others, slowly following Mig, stopped and turned until Mig finally did as well. What's that, French? I said no. I'm not going north. The rest of my little family looked at me with curiosity. Something had changed. Whether it was the second huge loss or the life I'd taken with all the speed and vengeance back at the cliff, I wasn't sure. But there was no more north in my heart, and I wasn't sure what I meant to do until I said it out loud. I'm going after Minerva. Okay, so we're on to On the Road. That's on page 154. Everything was different. We were faster without our youngest and oldest, but now we were without deep roots, without the acute need to protect and make better. And I had taken up a spot that opened up in the middle of it all, somewhere between desperation and resolve. We decided to find the resistance, and we knew there was a pocket of it near Espanola. We needed information to figure out which school Minerva would have taken to. Cheeboy and Mig never questioned the plan. We moved the same way as always, Mig as our leader, Cheeboy as the scout. But now I was with them, helping to shape our path forward. After all, I was the one who had put us here. It was a burden so heavy I could barely sleep at night for lack of breath. But what if I was leading us to our deaths? What if we were walking into a place full of more trickster Indians? What if there were no Indians at all? Instead of sleep, I counted the stars and kept 6 on the individual breathing of each remaining member, sleeping in their tents around me. The weather was shifting fast, and you couldn't see your breath anymore, not even in the hour before the sun rose. Meg and I were out collecting water from our tarp traps when we found the first sign that we were getting close. French, here. He motioned me over to a thin elm in front of a semicircle of pine. He pointed out to a small dent in the side of the trunk. I bent closer, and the dent turned into a scar, and then the scar revealed itself to be a series of deliberate cuts. What is it? Mig ran his fingers over the marks and gave a short laugh. Huh, I think they're syllabics. What's that? That is our written language. I reached out to feel the language on my skin for the first time since Minerva had breathed her words over my forehead when she thought I was sleeping during her nightly check-ins. An arrow, a line, a couple of dots. What does it mean? I don't know syllabics. Isaac was the linguist. But I do know it means there are Nish close by who do. He sounded more hopeful about an impending meeting than I would have imagined, especially after the last one. Maybe he felt something in the tree that I didn't. The next day we spent taking stock and repacking our gear. We needed to know exactly what we had if we were getting close to Espanola. And we needed to make sure there was nothing unnecessary left in our packs. Speed and agility were the benefits of a tighter group, and we needed both right now. Hey, French, if you want to come with me to look for mushrooms? It was Rose. Something about her voice made my neck prickle. It had to be her voice because there was nothing exciting about looking for squat fungus in the bush. Sure, I tried to play it cool. We didn't have much time to hang out these days, not with the ferocious pace I'd set and the breadth of my self-assigned duties. Moodiness, anxiety for the safety of every person, insomnia. S'go then. She motioned to me to follow with the tilt of her head, her long hair loose against her faded gray t-shirt. I got up from where I'd set up by the tent to count and recount ammo and followed her through the pines. The forest was quiet in here, like a room so full of small voices it hummed with silence. We walked for almost an hour, just listening, enjoying being close to each other without the distraction of the others, and the reminder that we were so much less than before. She stopped short in front of me, and I almost slammed into her back. See mushrooms? She shook her head. No, but I smell something. I opened my nostrils and tried to inhale slowly. She was right. There was something else there, something different in the woods. I think it's water. Her voice was a whisper, as if she could startle the water and it would rush off in the denser bush, leaving us behind. We walked into a small circle, sniffing at the air like dogs. Finally, she chose a direction, and we rushed forward. The trees were dotted with scabs. They sat like blisters on the smooth white of birch. They caught our hair as we passed, combing it across our skin. We left a few strands there, and I was happy in the leaving. I followed her to the smell of water, ecstatic, almost crazed with hope, and the small bundle that was building to a fire in my chest. She moved ahead, pushing through the dense bush like a coyote. I was seconds behind her, muscles pumping, face smiling, watching her break free and throw arms forward and back into wide strides. She was so beautiful. I wanted to catch her, and I wanted to watch her flee. I could find no satisfaction in my intentions. They were too tiny for the wholeness of her and who I was with her. I loved her. The certainty of that feeling was clear and bright and brown and lean, and it hit me in my throat so that breathing became weeping. And then she screamed from the other side of the trees. My pace doubled, eyes stinging. I jumped through the bush where she disappeared. I was ready to fight, fists already heavy. I was a man then, not a 16-year-old too skinny and awkward for real strength. And there she was, breathing so heavy her shoulders heaved up and down. She was standing in a clearing. And I pulled up beside her, grabbing her elbows both to stop myself and to take measure. What? What's wrong? I could barely breathe. I bent forward, hands on my knees to catch my breath. Her voice was high with excitement. Water! Real water! And I saw a fish right there. She pointed somewhere in the middle where the water tore into frills around rocks. It was a thin brown brook, pulling itself like a ribbon across the curve cut into the rock just ahead. It didn't rage or wave or crash. It bled from somewhere up the hill and carried itself with quiet grace across the tortured ground, over the glassy rocks, feeding bundles of greens with tenacious roots, some pulled from the split earth and dangling under the cool surface like old ladies, dipping vein-bruised legs into a pool. I fell to my knees, crunching into the early spring crust of leaves and dirt, laughing. It was too much. It was too much. Her and the bundle I carried for her and the water and the bush and everything. Everything made to ache and splinter and seek and throb by the loss of our parents, our homes, our words, our elder, and our Riri, our safety. I laughed until I was crying, and she moved closer, pulling my head to her legs so that I leaned there first, then clutched at her. She pushed a slight hand into my hair, brushing the branches and leaves out of its length. I pulled at her legs until she fell to my side. I reached, taking in as much of her as I could in my two skinny arms, pulling her into my chest, warm from the bundle burning there. There were sounds now that came from a memory of my uncle. My uncle and his old stereo and his army of battered CDs lined up on the kitchen counter, two stacks of cooking pots as bookends. He slurred even when he was sober, which was hardly ever. He pointed with palsy fingers. "Grab one there, boy." He dropped his arm and took a swig from a brown bottle. "And make it a good one, by the Jesus," he growled before taking another swallow. Mum and Dad were back in the house still, trying to figure out what was going on. They'd sent me and Mitch to our uncle's cabin out by Huron, since there were whispers of danger and missing kids. I was young enough to remain silent most of the time. Mitch was old enough to be loud, so Uncle preferred my company. Even now, Mitch was running wild with our cousins somewhere outside. I grabbed a thin plastic case from the middle of the stack, the way Uncle had taught me to choose a card when presented with a fanned-out deck. I hoped this one was the good one he'd asked for. I carried it to where he sat on a low stool with his bottle and belly fighting for room in his lap. He took another deep gulp and wiped his lips with the back of his hand, setting the empty bottle on the ground by his feet. "Let's see here." He took the CD from my hands and struggled to focus on the cover. "Oh ho!" He smiled real big, and I released my breath. "Oh boy, you some kind of seer or something?" He lowered his gaze to my face like a lion stooping to smell a daisy. I shook my head. "I think you must be. This here." He held the case up so I could see a bouquet of hands reaching for the sky or each other on a pink background with white letters behind them. "This here is exactly what we need." He took 2 tries to get onto his feet and took a minute to unplug some things and plug in others, and then finally the stereo whirred to life. He deposited the shiny disc, pushed some buttons, and picked his selection, then turned to face me where I'd taken his spot on the stool. He closed his eyes and straightened his back up against the counter and waited for the music to begin. Pearl Jam! Real tradish, these boys. Started with an echo turned inside out and a small yell like a man captured. Then the bottom fell out and he escaped, and I tumbled along his release. Snapping drums, a flexing of sound, and a high threading of guitar over a smoother cadence. And then the man sang, wrapping up and then throwing off, wrapping up and then throwing off. The sounds were relentless, and I wiggled a bit on the stool, uncomfortable in its strength. "What do you think, boy?" Uncle yelled over the high whine stacked on deep bottom notes. I thought for a long while, long enough for this song to start to spiral back into its first echo, and I answered it honestly as I could manage. "It sounds like if gray could make noise." That's what I heard here now, beside the water on this beautiful girl pulled into the bony shell of my arms. I heard capture and release and a high whine over something that echoed off the trees, growing downwards towards the brook like pious monks in all manner of fancy dress, voluminous green silks peeking out of their austere brown habits. How could anything be as bad as it was when this moment existed in the span of eternity? How could I have fear when this girl would allow me to be this close? How could anything matter but this small miracle of having someone I could love? And I kissed her, and I kissed her, and I didn't stop. I had no way of knowing things would shift again, that I wasn't as alone as I thought after all.